Now, keeping an eye on the time, because this is an Inspire Sunday, there'll be an opportunity to actually talk with one another and reflect for a few minutes on this message. Or not the message, you don't need to critique it, because believe me, the topic is one that I have struggled with, and this isn't really not an easy preach for me, not at all. You know, we've been in this series for quite some time about we're designed for discipleship, and part of this is to encourage one another, to put courage in. And yes, there we go, it is working. To put courage in. Sometimes it's really great, isn't it, when another person comes alongside when we're facing something and they say something that actually puts courage in us. And we go, okay, yep. And we take that deep breath and we walk into whatever it was that was creating anxiety or fear or presence. We find something. But if we're honest, a lot of the time, we don't actually share our fears or anxieties. We get a little bit embarrassed about that maybe. Or maybe we're not being realistic about the fact that we're fearful or anxious. Maybe we're in a situation where you find yourself, I've just got to pull myself up the bootstraps. I don't know if you remember that. My daughter has the saying, I've got to put my big girl pants on. Where you're just sort of going, okay, I can't get out of this situation. I'm going to have to face it. And so sometimes you're trying to find that strength. For some, there might be a technique that they have learned, breathing, all of those sorts of things. Some people may have even learned a mantra at some point that they've been encouraged to say. I want to suggest to you that perhaps the best approach might be a Bible verse in the form of a prayer. But this is one I heard frequently from particularly Phil's mum, as she was facing things, really struggling after having had a stroke and being quite restricted in what she could do. Anyone find themselves saying this a lot? I can do all things through him who strengthens me. It's one of those early ones that us of a certain age learnt by rote when we were in our younger years. So, sorry, there's something in my eye. It's annoying me. Hopefully I can, yep. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I do confess that I have heard this called upon in circumstances that I'm not quite sure were intended by Paul. We won't discuss those at the moment, but you might know what I mean. People who are using this to justify pursuing something that there's no way that they should be doing. But it is still nevertheless true. We can do all the things that God has ordained for us and calls us to. Through him. I find it interesting that the NIV has just sort of tweaked it a bit. It says, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. I can do all this. So what is the this? What is actually Paul talking about? And so let's open up. If you have your Bibles with you, please open up to Philippians 4. That's where we're up to. We're in the closing verses of this remarkable letter that we have been looking at for several weeks. We're going to be starting at verse 10. And as this is the closing, Paul has addressed everything he really wanted to address in the sense that this is actually a letter of thanksgiving. You know, it starts out with partnership in the gospel, and this is his closing part, and it's a very personal part, and in between he's addressed all manner of things. But he says this, he says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learnt to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who strengthens me. Doesn't that put it in a context? I've learnt the secret of being content, he says. Learnt. I find that encouraging. Is something you can learn. Now, on its own, this word is really interesting, isn't it? Because you don't actually know where to put the emphasis. Is this content or is it content? You actually need it to be surrounded by others to know its context. You need its context to know where to put the inflections. But they are related. You see, content is about what's contained within something, the contents of a box. These days there's whole careers in content creators who are creating content to put into something or onto something. Usually it's related to social media. But there are whole things. What it is about is what is inside, what is within. When we're talking about being content, different emphasis, we usually have a picture in our mind that is about peaceful, happiness, satisfaction. I think instantly most people will have, when they're thinking of content, I'm sure it probably involves something very closely related to relaxation in our mind. But I'm not sure that that's what it is. To be content. Is it etymology? Entomologists. Etymologists. I have to add the little Swiss French accent there. Etymologist. They have defined this as the contented person's desires are bound by what he or she already has. We got that? The contented person's desires are bound by what he or she already has. I'm not actually sure I agree with that. Because I think you can have desires but still be content. Is that making sense? I just think it's where you put your focus. Is it the desire that is driving you? Or is it one day I hoped to be X, Y, Z. But I'm okay with where I'm at. When the Bible talks about content or content, it is actually the auto is self. Self-sufficient, contented, satisfied, independent. Now that doesn't sound like that aligns with this whole relational thing, to be independent and in community. So we need to unpack that a little bit. But ultimately, when Scripture and when Paul is talking about I have learnt to be content, he's talking about I have an inward sufficiency. But it's not an inward sufficiency based on self. That's very clear by I can do all this or I can do these things because of him who strengthens me. It is entirely God-produced. Entirely God-produced. The Holman Dictionary describes it as an internal satisfaction which does not demand changes in external circumstances. Ever found yourself demanding that God change something? I know I have. I wonder if a sign of being content is when you don't feel compelled to give your time, your attention, your focus, your energy to have to gain what you do not have. So when Paul is saying, I can do all this through him who gives me strength, he is explaining that he has learnt the secret to being content. So he's wrestled with this. This is not something that came natural. And he says he's learnt to be content in any and every situation. It's not to rely on self to get through it, as self-sufficiency would suggest, but he gets through it through the strength of Christ. He is empowered. For all things, the literal translation is this, for all things I have strength in the one strengthening me. Isn't that a lovely thought? I have strength in the one who is strengthening me. I think that that is good news. One, that we can learn this secret, but secondly, that it actually doesn't rely on us, but it relies on our faith in God, and actually our faith and our belief and our understanding of who God is actually really will contribute to a sense of what it is to be content, even when our circumstances don't change. Martin Luther, I don't have a slide for this, but Martin Luther commented on Paul's secret. He said, "The secret of contentment is the realization that life is a gift and not a right. Next to faith, this is the highest art, to be content with the calling in which God has placed you. Contentment will surely crown a Christian's life if he with conscious or she with conscious satisfaction exclaims, 'Why should I complain of my condition in life? It's good and pleasing in the sight of God.'" This is written in the 1500s, and I confess that I'm really conflicted about Luther's statement. Because unless you take it as a whole and include the realization that life is a gift, not just your life, but the life of the person next to you and the life of the person being bombed in whatever country we're talking about right now, or the life of the person living in poverty. And an important element is that we resist and combat the temptation to apply this to other people, as what happened through the 16s, 17s, 1800s, and still happens in some places today. That's how God designed them to be, so they should remain in their poverty and shouldn't try to get out of it. That is the misapplied concept of contentment. When it becomes an excuse to live in our comfort and go, well, they shouldn't really be complaining, that's how God created it. You see how this can be misapplied, yeah? And I do not believe for 1 second that Paul was implying that. Our contentment should not be an excuse for complacency, the type that becomes indifferent to the needs of others or that deems another should live in poverty. Poverty is not good and pleasing to the Lord. War is not good and pleasing to the Lord. Life is indeed a gift. And whilst millions around the world live a life content with their circumstances, in faith, because they rely on God's strength to help them get through it or get out of it through the most dire thing, death, He calls us to respond. A century later, an English Congregationalist and preacher, Jeremiah Burroughs, wrote, "Contentment is not by addition, but by subtracting. By subtraction, seeking to add a thing will not bring contentment. Indeed, subtracting from your desires, or those things that you're focused on, until you are satisfied only with Christ, brings contentment." About 2 months ago, I was speaking to a couple who come to our church. And they were sharing with me how they believe that actually they've been through a season where they felt like God was stripping lots of things away so that they could get down to the very basic of what it was to be totally reliant on Him. How content would you feel with that situation? I know I will wrestle with it, and I have wrestled with it. See, despite the circumstances, despite the outcome, and even if waiting in hope for something better, I believe we can still be content. I don't know about you, but I do find that incredibly challenging. The temptation is to believe that we have to settle for how things are and eliminate all hope for something different. But I don't think that's what Paul is saying at all. Paul is not applying the secret of contentment to what is happening in the world. And indeed, he was certainly not content with false teaching in the church. You can see that earlier in the verses. Or what is happening to the gospel. When Paul is talking about the secret to contentment, it's in the context of what he personally does and does not have. That's not, in that context, it is very definitely about food and, little and plenty. But it's also about clothing. He's also stuck in prison. I don't know how content I would be not being able to just go out and have a walk. Whilst Paul found the secret to being content in any and every situation, he says he is able to do these things because of him, God who strengthens him and his very presence. You know, psychologists are spending a lot of time looking at contentment like they did generosity, finding some things. And the more psychologists look at these things and research them, the more I just want to get the Bible and show it to them and say, yeah, that's right there. That's okay. Now, I'm okay if psychology and medicine and science continue. They have their place, but they will continue to align with what the Creator put in place from the very beginning. So I'm not worried about it. But they did a series of studies. It was released in February this year, Contentment and Self-Acceptance, Well-Being Beyond Happiness. It concluded that contentment is a unique positive emotion that is central to well-being and life satisfaction. Central. That is how they have found it. They suggest that contentment is not a situational perception itself given to any event. So in other words, I'm not content here but discontent there. They're sort of implying it's a state of being, but it relies on one's general life conditions, that actually what we're in is sufficient enough and complete enough. We see this wrestle that Paul has, and we can see it in 2 Corinthians 12, because Paul had something that he was facing, and 3 times he says to God, please remove this. It's an undisclosed thorn of the flesh. And he pleads with God, take it away. He's not content with whatever this is that is happening for him. He calls it a torment. But he hears God answer, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul accepts that this thorn will be part of him, but that God is greater than it. That God is greater than it. That his power and grace will be sufficient. And Paul goes on to say, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power, and this is the same power that strengthens him, may rest on me. But it's not just psychologists who are talking about contentment. There's a whole movement called the minimalist movement. Anybody heard of the minimalist movement? Yep. Okay. A lot of what the minimalist movement is about is actually going, do you really need this? So a man called Joshua Becker, he's a writer, practitioner and leader in minimalism. He commentates on the pursuit of contentment and this collision between contentment and generosity. He says not just contentment as self-acceptance, but how it feels and about what the results are. He reflects on the pursuits of Western culture. You know, I'll be happier when the house is bigger, when the kids all have a bedroom, when I have that car that I can put that big caravan on, when I take that European holiday, when I get that promotion, things will just settle down and then we'll be right. Or if I work FIFO and just do that for a couple of years, we'll be set up for life. Slightly mythical. Or if I just upgrade my iPhone to iPhone 16, my life will be easier. Oh no, sorry, we're back to Androids, aren't we? If you don't know what I'm talking about, that is a good sign. But Josh Becker reflects on this. He said, could it be that what we have been taught, where we have been taught to look for contentment, is in all the wrong places? What if contentment is actually found in the exact opposite place than where we have been looking? What if contentment, he said, is not found in accumulating more, but is actually found in giving more? And he goes on to say, we can easily understand how contentment leads to generosity. If you're a very generous person, chances are you're very content with your life situation. But he says, what if generosity will lead to more contentment? What if the inverse is true, he says? That the two collide, contentment and generosity, together in a way that encourages each other to exist all the more. Goes on to say, consider for a moment just how generosity leads to contentment. These are all based on studies. Generous people have a healthy understanding of how much they already own. Do you know how wealthy we are? Generous people value what they own. Generous people live happier, more fulfilled lives. Generous people find meaning outside of their possessions. Generous people have more fulfilling relationships. Now, I read all this and I must say I was initially concerned. I'm concerned. But I did some more work. Joshua Becker now dedicates his life work to living and promoting generosity through minimalism in order to make the place a better world, because he was first a pastor teaching on Philippians 4. And he said, lots of people can be better pastors than I ever was. But if I can inspire people to think differently through generosity, maybe they will attend. And I want to say, I hope that they attain not just generosity and contentment, but they attain that contentment knowing that the Christ will indeed strengthen them. May they discover the simplicity of Jesus' life in that pursuit. And I wonder if that's what the Philippians also learnt. Not only Paul's secret to contentment, not found actually just within themselves, but through giving. Because in verse 14, Paul goes on to say, it was good of you to share in my troubles. You see, this generosity, if you like, is not only about finances. This is about caring. It is good for you to share in my troubles. So this was generous hearts, generous minds, generous time. They sent, in the next verses, they sent their gift with Epaphroditus. That's generosity. They've set someone aside to go there. That's generous hearts, minds, not just finances. Where Paul says, moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except for you alone. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about Paul, I think he's really well respected, well supported. You know, that's the sort of thing we imagine. But he's not. He's out there on his own doing it tough. Not one church was supporting him except the Philippians. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once, repeated generosity. It's not that I desire your gifts, says Paul. What I desire is more that it be credited to your account. I've received full payment and have more than enough. I am amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. They are indeed a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God, and my God will meet all your needs. So I'm wondering, how content are you with your contents? How content are you with what's inside? Inside your homes, inside your bank account, as well as what's inside your mind, your relationships, your body? How content are you with what you have and who you are? And what you think and think of others and do for others? See, contentment should never lead to complacency. How content are you with who God is? Do you have to strive and strive and strive to arrive at a position where you no longer need your faith in God? Or to control a situation to such an extent that God has no place to respond? How content are you with your experience of God? Have you let go enough? Have you pleaded with him time after time for that thing and still be okay when he says, actually, this is how it's going to be? See, when we can give up that wrestle and actually sit in that, that's where contentment lays. Doesn't mean we don't have hope. Doesn't mean that we go, yeah, one day I'd like to, but if it never happens, I'm okay with that. And it doesn't mean that we superimpose that on others and say, well, what should they be complaining about? That's how God created them. Would you like to be in their situation? Have you learnt the secret yet? We're going to go into a time of thinking. You see, Paul later and in other places in Timothy addresses this whole pursuit of money and finances. And so I think part of our challenge is, are we content in our richness as well as our poverty? If you're in a place of plenty, then you can be content with that. It's not saying money is the problem. It's the pursuit of money above all things that is. If you're in a struggling situation that may not change, how content are you if it doesn't change? But I guess my question is, how content are we as a community that there would be some within us who are in need? Because I'm not content with that. You see the challenge and the balance? So this is an opportunity for you to be able to sort of process that with each other a little bit. Now, this is a time that for some of us, we find this a bit tricky, and that's okay. If you're not sitting next to someone and you really want to just be able to share that, please move there. If you're not wanting to have the conversation but wanting to just reflect quietly, that's okay too. If somebody comes and sits next to you, can you just, but you know, if somebody says to you, please, I just want to think about this myself, don't be offended, but just give them that space. Is that okay? So we're just going to have a couple of minutes, and here are some questions for you to think about. Oh, sorry, they're tiny, aren't they? You can talk about whatever part of this you prompted you and spoke to you. But here's something. In general, do you think you are more content or discontent? Do you whinge a lot? Or you might want to ask, when are you content? How has God supplied your needs? Another question might be, what do you think about the suggestion that being generous helps people experience contentment? Have you ever been generous beyond your means? And if so, what was the result of that at that time? Or what part does your faith in God play in considering being generous or giving? So there's a few prompters for a few moments. So I'll leave you a couple of minutes and I'll come back up in probably about 4 minutes and give us a benediction. It's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because there's so many experiences in this room. So many experiences of times of need and times of plenty. Not only financially or resource-wise, but in facing our circumstances. And, a 10-year journey with my eldest daughter and her health, and learning to be content in that there was no miracle coming. And seeing her journey through that, and praise God, and the acceptance that comes when what happens is, okay, this is who it is. This is the new normal now. That's how we tend to describe it, isn't it? This is the new normal, and now I know that's the new normal, and God is strengthening me to get through that. They're good things. My prayer for us this morning is that we'll continue to wrestle with this. Not just the surface level, oh yes, I'm going to be content for myself, but what does that mean for others? Be careful, I guess, when we realise that we're content, And how content are we that there is other stuff happening that actually we can do something towards? We can be generous in our thinking. We can be generous in our minds. We can be generous with our time. And in doing so, what will that lead to? And I suspect that both are true. When you're content, you'll be more generous. When you're more generous, you'll actually be more content. So that's my hope. Shelby, I hope that's okay for me to say. Shelby went, I'm just so glad it was obvious you wrestled with this and are wrestling with that. I am wrestling with this. I think there's a big wrestle in those spaces about what contentment and acceptance is. But what I've come to really consider is, if I ask why I'm in discontent, it'll usually come down to an element of a misunderstanding of who God is and what He can do. So don't be afraid to wrestle with this, and please be brave enough to go through and say, what does this tell me? If I believe this, what is this telling me about God? And is that really who God is? They're my thoughts. So I'm going to close us in Hebrews 13:5. Okay. Keep your lives free from the love of money or the love of position or the love of status or the love of any one of a number of things. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? May we have the courage to learn the secret of being content in any and all circumstances, and may that let it spill over into generosity of mind, generosity of spirit, generosity of kindness, and of giving. Thank you.